Hello everyone, welcome back. And in this video, I'm going to try to finish up where I left off. I didn't think this was going to take as long as it has. I'm more surprised at it than anybody else, but I'm going to get through the last leg of this and be done with this section that I wanted to get into. One thing I want to talk about real quick before I get into this, once I get through this pre-vampire stuff, pre-cinema vampire stuff rather, I was planning on talking about vampire movies and just trying to go through as much of them as I can. But here's the problem. For anyone who cares, I'm not exactly sure how YouTube works. By that, I mean the copyright stuff. That seems to be the major problem that I'm having is the copyright. Because some of the stuff that I have planned on talking, at least the first video, to my knowledge, everything is in public domain, so I don't have any issues there. I can show clips, I can do whatever I want with those. But once we get into stuff like the 1931 Dracula film starring Bela Lugosi by Todd Browning, and everything past that, copyright takes hold. And I've been told, I don't know, I've been looking videos up on this topic, and I'm just completely lost, to be honest with you. Some stuff says you can show pictures, but you can't show clips. Some stuff says you can show clips up to 20 to 30 seconds, as long as it's in fair use, but a lot of fair use stuff is getting taken down left and right. Look up where's the fair use, hashtag where's the fair use. And you'll see a lot of the issues that a lot of people are having with that. And the other thing I've been told is that you're supposed to contact a company. Like if I wanted to, let's say for example, the Dracula one there that I was mentioning, that's owned by Universal Studios, so I would have to somehow get in touch with Universal Studios and ask permission, maybe pay a fee to be able to use footage in the way that I plan on doing it, similar to the one that I'm going to do in the future with the stuff that's in public domain. But there are over 700, maybe 8 at this point, maybe 900 or 1,000 vampire movies, and every single movie studio owns a vampire movie. So does that mean that I'm going to have to go through and contact every single movie studio that has ever existed in order to do reviews? I'm hoping that's not the case. I'm looking into that, but that could kind of put a halt to what I want to do real fast. And the problem is, it's not that, because I'm nobody. I've got I've got 3 or 4 videos up now, and I've got a total of like 20 views, and most of them are from me and my friends. But it doesn't matter. YouTube is operated on, it works on algorithms. So they automatically detect footage that's copyrighted, and it won't, what I'm told, my videos, if I try to use copyrighted material, that I'm unaware that it's copyrighted, the video won't even load. It will not appear on my page, and you guys won't see it at all. So that's sort of the hurdle that I'm at right now. I don't know what to do about that, where to go, what's truth, what's lies. I don't know. But I'm looking into it, and I also plan on doing other videos. I know this is starting out, as vampire stuff. I was just kind of get my foot in the door just to see what I could do with this, just for fun, just to test myself as an idea, and just to see where I could take all this. If it was good, bad, I think I'm somewhere in the middle of there, but that's just my opinion. And of course, any kind of project picture, stuff on the side, as you can see here, anything I do, I always think it's not that great. Other people say it's good or it's awesome, and I'm always just like, it could be better. But that's just me, and it's probably just the artistic side. Anybody who's an artist knows what I'm talking about. They deal with this on a regular basis. And I used to play drums back in the day and played in bands and stuff I listened to that I recorded that I got left this too far in time. I listen back to it, and I'll show it to people. They'll be like, it's awesome, and I just think it sucks. So But I just wanted to see where I could take this, and it's passable. That's my opinion on it. I know that I'm not exactly the most charismatic, and that can be kind of boring to listen to, and I don't blame anybody if they find me that way at all. But there are other topics that I want to talk about that aren't vampire related. But I've got the stuff that I need to do more research on it. At the moment, I'm doing the vampire stuff just because that's what I know the most of, that I can make videos out of. So I'm doing that, and my plan was to just keep doing a bunch of vampire videos, and build up an audience, and in the process research other things. But because of all this copyright stuff, that's going to be kind of hard. So there might be gaps in between videos, and anybody that finds these and they find them interesting, I apologize if there are long gaps between videos, because that's just me doing research to find an interesting topic to talk about. So I think that's everything that I want to mention before I finish up here and continue on. Let me finish up. If I believe, if I remember correctly, I left off talking about the Serbian vampire in my last video. And the Serbian vampire, just as a quick reminder, he was just some guy who died. I believe his name was Peter Blagovic. Let me just look at my notes real quick here. I'm pretty sure that was his name. Yep, Peter Blagovic. Somewhere between 1720, 1730. It was a guy who died. And it was all hysteria because people started dying within 8 days after his death. And they believed that was attributed to him coming back as a vampire and killing them for a short amount of time. And they dug up his grave, for signs of vampirism, which were hair growing, fingernails growing, and they didn't know that that's something that happens after you die. So they just thought, hey, that's proof that he's still living after death. So he's a vampire and he's responsible for the deaths of all these people. So, and I wanted to mention also, I realized I was editing all my videos. Of course, I rewatched these things like 4 or 5 times, putting everything together, and I, hear myself as well while I'm talking and the things that I've talked about. I want to mention that somewhere between the 16 and 1700s, this is the one thing, and it irks the hell out of me, but I could not find when or in what instance or the reason why, but it's somewhere between 1600 and 1700 that the word vampire comes into use. We go from revenants to vampires. Why the change? Why people, why that word what the proto word that became vampire is, I don't know that information. I wish I did so I could share it with you, but that's the one thing that I don't know. But I do know that it's around that time period, which is why in these early 1700s, like Peter here, he was referred to as a vampire, not a revenant. And from this point on, any kind of supernatural being that comes back from the dead and attacks the living is referred to as vampire. And then at some point, I'm not sure exactly when, but zombies come all around as well. And it kind of makes you wonder too, in the future, what we're going to call creatures like this, or what they're going to evolve into. Will they still remain vampires forever, or will they become something else? Same thing with zombies. Will we just keep referring to them as zombies forever, or will they be called something else as well? Or will a third category of creatures with similar attributes come around? But maybe the old stuff will come back. Maybe revenants will be relevant again, and because it's ghosts and dead coming back to life, or maybe bat eels. You never know, and that's sort of the interesting thing. Is just as time goes on, things change, but maybe retro stuff will become new again. So look forward to seeing if that ever happens. But the Serbian vampire story, it inspired the first vampire story and it's in a poem. And I'm going to spare you just for time. You can look it up for yourself. You can find it on Google, Wikipedia, several pages that have it. So I'm not going to read the poem. I'll just say briefly about it. It was written in 1748. So 1748 marks when the first vampire fiction comes about. And it was written by a guy named Henrik Ossenfelder. And his poem was called Der Vampyre. Or just, English translation, The Vampire. Which is kind of funny in a way. You'll see in a minute why that is. But the story was simply about a guy who died, just like Blagovich, who comes back to drink the blood of a young maiden and give her, the immortal vampire kiss. But it doesn't get any more specific. It's poetry, so it's kind of vague. So it could literally be a kiss on the mouth. It could be a kiss on the neck. It doesn't really specify, as I recall. Just that it's a vampire kiss and drinking blood and just whatever that's supposed to mean. But for the next, 50, 60 years or so, vampire stories, fiction rather, they came in the form of poems inspired by Der Vampire. And we don't get the first real vampire story because a lot of the poetry, the vampires don't have names. They're just the vampire, or it's just talking about what they do. And there's not background story. There's no motivation other than, they attack and drink blood, blah, blah, blah. But in 1819, the first vampire story is written. But I want to backtrack just 3 years earlier, because this is kind of an interesting story. In 1816, there was a man by the name of Lord Byron. Now, some of you may have heard of Lord Byron. He went to Geneva that year, in June of that year. And Lord Byron invited some guests. He wanted to have a party. But the party got rained out. There was just a massive thunderstorm. And him and his guests were stuck in the house. And to pass the time, they read horror stories to each other out of the book written at the time called Phantasmagoria. And then him and his guests, they decided to play a game after they were finished with that because the storm was still raging outside. So they decided to write their own vampire stories. They decided to write their own horror stories. And then read their stories or ideas or whatnot. And two of the people, and it's kind of interesting because from what I can see, there was some stuff written, but like the stories as we know them didn't come about till after this party. But there were two guests in particular at his party of note. The first was actually not surprising that he was there, but his physician was there, a guy by the name of John Williams Polidori, who had been traveling with Byron from England to Geneva and a bunch of other places as well. And another guest, more famously, which is probably why the name Lord Byron kind of rings a bell to some of you, is he had a guest there by the name of Mary Shelley. Now, Mary Shelley in 1818, if I'm remembering correctly, I didn't write it in my notes, but off the top of my head, I think that's the correct year. She's famous for writing the science fiction horror story Frankenstein. Now, the physician guy there, Polidori, he didn't write a story that night, but Byron did. And Byron had written a poem earlier, a couple years earlier, about a vampire in the tradition of the, Der Vampire poetry tradition. And Polidori took ideas from that, as well as ideas from the story that Byron wrote that night, which he ended up throwing away. Wasn't really good, but it inspired something. And the closest equivalent that I can compare this to is if you're familiar with the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's actually a collaboration between Stanley Kubrick, who made the movie, of course, but it's also it was a collaboration between him and author Arthur C. Clarke. And the way it came about was that years earlier, Arthur C. Clarke had written a story called The Sentinel. It's just a short story. And Kubrick read it, and he saw in that story more, it just, gave him tons of ideas. He saw more in it than was there and more than what Arthur C. Clarke, could think about with that story. And with Kubrick's help, the two of them created the masterpiece that we know today, both in the novel version and the movie version. Likewise, Polidori saw something in Byron's story, and it just, gave him this great idea. And he also based it partially off of Byron himself. And in 1819, we get the first vampire fiction story called The Vampyre. Which is why I said before, the Der Vampire, or it's translated would be The Vampire by Ossenfelder. It's kind of ironic, because like the first two vampire stories are called, in the poetry tradition, and then in the literary, short story, novel tradition, is also called The Vampire. Gets a little confusing, but it just kind of, it tickled my fancy, let's just put it that way, finding that out. Now, when Polidori wrote his book, there was a little bit of controversy in that a lot of people misattributed it due to his relationship with Byron. And they thought that Byron had written the story. But this was later, made right, and Polidori was given the proper authorship of the story. But there was a little bit of confusion there, and there were some early publications of this book had Byron's name on it instead of Polidori's. But in Polidori's version, this is where the modern vampire really starts to emerge. In that we see a lot of tropes that at the time were brand spanking new, but they're old hat to us at this point. But they were very interesting at the time. And one of those things was the fact that, if you remember in some of my other videos, I mentioned that vampires and vampire-like creatures in the past, they were beings who, existed in dark places. They were in trees, hanging upside down, all alone. Or in the case of the Blagovich guy there, the real life one, he's just some peasant guy. And there was that story from, the Williams guy there from medieval times, writing the History of English Affairs, when he had the story about the guy who was the thief, or the murderer, or the criminal, whose wife was cheating on him, and he comes back, and all that stuff. They're all, lower class. They're, I don't want to say people, not, people of no consequence, but in a story, setting, fiction-wise, pretty much, where, there are people who don't have any influence on anything. They're not important figures. They're just people that, stuff happens to them, and they kind of run with it and come back, whatever. But this story sets a new precedent. It raises the level where the vampire is this higher class, high-born, upper-class, rich, powerful person. He's an aristocrat, which is where you get the, the lord, the count, all that sort of stuff. It comes from this, the sir, and there's, we see this tradition to this day, and so many examples of just, the rich, the powerful, like I said, people who in life, before they were vampires, had authority. They had power. And just being a vampire just made it that much, made them more powerful in a lot of ways. They're also the person that, they command your attention. They're not somebody who just hides in the shadows. They're right out in front of you. You see them at parties. You see their influence. And There are people who will just converse with you. They have no fear of anything really, and that starts with this one story in the Vampyre that in Polidori's story is known as Lord Ruthven. Now, Lord Ruthven is an interesting figure. It was all those things that I mentioned, but there are a few other things about him that some of which I wish were still traditions today, or at least done properly, because I think that there are a lot of good ideas in this particular story that could be used in a modern vampire story, which I'll explain in a second. The story, it's I don't know. I personally found it a little weak. It's a kind of a short story, so it's not a lot there, but it's kind of mostly about this guy Lord Ruthven, who you get this other character. I don't recall. It's been a while since I read this story. I should have looked it up a little bit more, admittedly, but there's a character who's telling the story. I can't remember if we ever are told his name, but he's sort of following and documenting Lord Ruthven. We're getting it more from his perspective, but he kind of wants to be. He's attracted to him, is the way I want to put it. Where there's something about him that captures everybody's attention, but everybody's afraid of him, of Lord Ruthven, at the same time. They can't put their finger on what it is. And this Lord Ruthven, he goes after women and stuff like that, and travels all over the world, and he disappears, and he comes back, and people are trying to. And this particular character, rather, is just trying to figure it all out. And I don't want to spoil it. If you ever want to read it, I invite you to read it for yourself. So I don't want to give away too many spoilers. But one of the really interesting things about the story that I've really found interesting, it's the part that I find could work today, is that he only needs to feed once a month. In every other vampire story, they go out every night, or like every other night, or they gotta feed on rats or whatever. But it's still like they gotta feed, almost as regularly as a human, which I understand. They want to kind of compare, hunger, human hunger and vampire hunger aren't that dissimilar. But it's very interesting to think about it in terms of you only had to feed once a month, and that the blood that you drain from somebody, would sustain you and keep you alive for that long, because it would make it, especially back in these days when people, died of all sorts of stuff and nobody really knew why. We're talking about a time where they still, like I said, with the Blagovich guy, people believed that hair growing after you're dead for like a week meant that you were a vampire. I mean, they had no idea about natural, all sorts of causes of death, and I don't think germ theory was even a thing at this point. So they had no idea about bacteria, viruses, any of that stuff. And then, not to mention, people would just go missing and just disappear, or be found dead, whatever, murderers, left and right. No, maybe not that bad, but, it just, one person disappearing a month would go unnoticed. That's my point. Whereas if you have somebody who's killing people on a nightly basis, or even a weekly basis, the bodies, you're going to find a pattern quick, and you're going to find that vampire a lot sooner. But if it's like 12 victims in a year, statistically, especially if it's in a big city, you're never going to find out that, unless you actually see and get evidence with, a camera or something like that, which didn't exist back in this time. You're never going to find Lord Ruthven and put pieces together that he's the vampire. So I think that's just an interesting take that you could, I said, apply to stories today, and that they should do today.